Chosen one, there is something happening inside you that no one ever gave you language for. A pulling, a pressure behind the eyes when the world moves too slowly. A quiet rage when you see things being done wrong and everyone around you simply nods along. A hunger that food cannot satisfy, that sleep cannot cure, that company cannot fill. You have carried it your whole life, sometimes calling it ambition, sometimes calling it restlessness, sometimes calling it loneliness, and sometimes, in the dark and honest hours of the night, calling it a burden. But I want to offer you a different name today. What you have been carrying is not a burden. What you have been carrying is a weapon. And until you understand that, you will keep trying to put it down when you were born to raise it. We need to talk about intelligence, not the kind that universities measure and employers reward, though it may include that. Not the kind that wins arguments at dinner tables or earns degrees on walls, though it may produce those things too. I am talking about something older and deeper than any institution's definition. I am talking about the living, breathing, fire-lit faculty inside you that refuses to accept the world at face value. The part of you that asks why when everyone else asks how. The part that traces things back to their roots when the world is content to only water the leaves. The part that feels the gap between what is and what ought to be like a physical ache in the chest. That intelligence, that sacred restlessness, is a spiritual weapon. And the world has spent a very long time trying to convince you to lay it down. Let us begin where all honest conversations must begin, with the truth about what is at stake. We are living in an era of engineered thoughtlessness. Every system that profits from your passivity, every ideology that requires your compliance, every relationship that depends on your self-doubt, has a vested interest in keeping you just intelligent enough to function and not quite intelligent enough to question. The entertainment is designed to consume your hours. The outrage is designed to exhaust your energy. The comparison is designed to paralyze your confidence. And the theology, in far too many places, is designed to make you hand your mind to an authority and call the surrender faith. The result is a world full of people who are alive but not awake, who are busy but not purposeful, who are religious but not transformed, who are educated but not free. And somewhere in that world is you. Reading this, feeling something stir, because you always could feel what others were too comfortable to notice. To understand why your intelligence is spiritual, you first have to dismantle the lie that split them apart. Somewhere in the history of Western civilization, a great divorce was arranged between reason and revelation, between the mind and the soul, between thinking and believing. The scientists were told that faith was superstition, and the faithful were told that science was godlessness, and both sides accepted terms that served neither of them. The result was a culture that produced brilliant minds with no moral anchor, and devout hearts with no intellectual spine. But every great tradition, when you go back far enough, before the politics and the institutionalization and the corruption of power, knew something different. Every original voice of spiritual wisdom was first and foremost a thinker of extraordinary depth. The very first command recorded in the Quran is not to bow, it is not to fast, it is not to give. The first command is to read, Iqra, to read, to recite, to engage the mind with what has been written in the universe. The entire Islamic intellectual tradition that followed, the algebra and the astronomy and the philosophy and the medicine that kept human knowledge alive during Europe's long dark centuries, was not a departure from the spiritual, it was an expression of it. The highest act of worship, in that original understanding, was the engagement of a God-given mind with a God-made world. In the Hebrew tradition, wisdom is not a concept, wisdom is a presence. The book of Proverbs personifies wisdom as a woman who stands in the streets and cries out, not to the weak and the weary, but to anyone willing to listen, willing to turn, willing to think. And in that tradition, the fear of the Lord, the beginning of all wisdom, is not a terror that shuts thinking down. It is an orientation of the entire person, mind included, toward what is ultimately real and ultimately good. The Psalms are not simple comfort songs. They are the records of a mind in violent and honest conversation with the divine, a mind that argues and doubts and demands and eventually, through the wrestling, arrives at something that could never have been reached by passive acceptance. The Buddha did not reach enlightenment by emptying his mind of all engagement. He reached it by applying an extraordinary level of sustained, disciplined attention to the nature of suffering and the path beyond it. The entire tradition that followed him is essentially a technology of the mind, a set of practices for training perception and attention toward clarity. Jesus, in the Gospel accounts, was above all else a teacher whose primary method was the question. He answered questions with questions, He told stories that opened rather than closed. He invited people into thought rather than demanding that they stop thinking. When the lawyers and the Pharisees came to trap him, his weapon was not power or authority or position. His weapon was a mind so clear and so rooted in truth that no verbal trap could hold him. Intelligence in every original spiritual framework is not a threat to the divine, it is a reflection of it. So when someone tells you to stop asking questions, when a system requires your intellectual surrender as the price of admission, when love is offered to you on the condition that you become less of what you truly are, you are not being asked to be faithful. You are being asked to be manageable, and those are not the same thing. Now let us talk about what it costs you when you put the weapon down, because most of us have done it. Most of us at some point in response to ridicule or rejection or simply exhaustion have tried to make ourselves smaller, have swallowed the question that was burning in our throat, have pretended to be convinced when we were not, have nodded at the meeting, at the pulpit, at the dinner table when everything inside us was raising its hand and saying, "This is not right, this does not add up, something is being left unsaid here." And we told ourselves it was kindness or humility or peacekeeping, but let us be honest about what it actually was. It was survival. And survival, while necessary, is not purpose. Every time you compress your intelligence to fit a space that was built without you in mind, you pay a tax. The tax is collected in the currency of your vitality. You become a little more tired, a little more cynical, a little more distant from the self that used to believe it was here for something specific. You start to mistake the numbness for peace and the accommodation for wisdom. And slowly, across years, the weapon that was meant to cut through the darkness is buried under so many layers of adaptation that you forget it is there, until something cracks you open again. A loss, a failure, a betrayal, a moment of grace so unexpected it breaks through every defense you built, and the weapon glints again from under the rubble of who you became, calling you back to who you were made to be. I want to speak now directly to the person who grew up being told that their intelligence was a problem. Maybe you were the child who asked too many questions and the adults called it disrespect. Maybe you were the student who saw through the approved narrative and the teacher called it defiance. Maybe you were the believer who could not reconcile what was preached from the front with what was practiced in private, and the community called your honesty division. Maybe you were the partner who noticed the patterns too clearly, whose perceptions were too accurate for the relationship to survive, and so the relationship tried to convince you that your perceptions were wrong. In each of those cases, the same thing was happening. Someone whose power depended on your unawareness encountered the threat of your awareness, and they called the threat by your name. But the problem was never your intelligence. The problem was that your intelligence was inconvenient for someone else's comfort. Here is the spiritual truth about discernment, and I want you to hold it carefully. The capacity to perceive what is real, to see through surfaces to the substance beneath, to distinguish between what is true and what is merely repeated with enough force to sound true. That capacity is not arrogance, it is a gift, and in the deepest sense it is a grace. Every tradition that has ever taken goodness seriously has understood that the world contains darkness as well as light, deception as well as truth, harm dressed in the costume of help, and violence wearing the face of love. And the only protection against being consumed by what wears a benevolent mask is the ability to think clearly about what you are actually seeing. Discernment is not cynicism. Cynicism assumes everything is corrupt. Discernment examines and determines. Cynicism closes. Discernment opens and then, having opened, makes an honest assessment. Your discernment is not pride, it is your protection, and it is the protection of everyone your life touches. There is another dimension of this I need to name, and it is the dimension of vision. The chosen ones throughout history were not simply people who could analyze the present with clarity, though they could. They were people who could imagine a future that the present gave no evidence for, and then organize their entire lives around making that imagined future real. This capacity to see what does not yet exist and refuse to accept its non-existence as permanent is perhaps the most spiritually charged dimension of human intelligence. It is what every prophet ever called upon actually did. They looked at the actual conditions of their people, conditions of oppression, confusion, moral decay, spiritual poverty, and they said, "This is not the final word." They held in their minds an image of what could be, what ought to be, what they believed was the true destination, and they walked toward it even when every external circumstance argued against the journey. Harriet Tubman could not simply run north. Her intelligence had to map the geography of freedom in a landscape designed to make freedom impossible. It had to read the stars, calculate the seasons, identify the allies in a network that could not be written down, assess every risk with a precision that left no margin for error, because the margin for error was death or re-enslavement. Every single journey she made, and she made many, was an act of strategic intelligence operating at the highest possible level. Was it also courageous? Absolutely. Was it also faith? Without question. But do not separate the faith from the thinking. The faith was not instead of the thinking. The faith was expressed through the thinking. Her belief that God was guiding her was not an excuse to stop calculating. It was the foundation that made the calculating possible, that made it worth the risk, that made the fear navigable rather than paralyzing. Frederick Douglass taught himself to read in secret, understanding, at an age when most children are still learning to tie their shoes, that the ownership of his mind was the only freedom his captors could not legally formalize. They could own his body, they could own his labor, they could own his time, but the moment he learned to read, they could no longer own the world inside his skull. And from that interior world, everything else eventually followed. The speeches, the newspapers, the advocacy, the testimony before presidents, the life that became a monument to what happens when you refuse to let anyone take your mind from you. He did not become free and then become intelligent. His intelligence was the mechanism of his freedom. Let me now address something that I think is perhaps the most under-examined spiritual crisis of our time, the epidemic of borrowed thinking. We live in an age of unprecedented access to information, and somehow it has made us less capable of original thought rather than more. We consume opinions by the thousands and produce few of our own. We know what our tribe thinks, what our network thinks, what the algorithm has decided we should think, and we wear those thoughts like clothing without ever asking whether they fit the actual shape of who we are. This is not the failure of information, it is the failure of the spiritual practice of sitting alone with your own mind and asking it honest questions. It is the failure of what the ancient traditions called contemplation, meditation, discernment, prayer, all of which at their root are practices of turning the intelligence inward and demanding truth from yourself before you demand it of anyone else. The chosen one is not the person who has the most followers or the loudest platform or the most confident opinions. The chosen one is the person who has done the brutally honest work of examining their own life, their own wounds, their own assumptions, their own unexamined beliefs, and who has emerged from that examination changed, refined, clearer, more honest, more useful, less concerned with how they appear and more committed to what they are actually for. That kind of person becomes, almost inevitably, a force, not because they sought power, but because truth has its own gravity, and a person who is genuinely aligned with truth, whose thinking and living and speaking are all pulling in the same direction, cannot help but pull others toward that center. I want to talk about failure for a moment, because any honest speech about intelligence as a spiritual weapon must reckon with the fact that the chosen ones fall, magnificently sometimes, in ways that seem to contradict everything they stood for. Moses, the greatest prophet in the Hebrew tradition, struck the rock in rage when he was told to speak to it, and that failure cost him the promised land. David committed adultery and then compounded it with what amounted to murder. Paul, who wrote most of the New Testament, began his story by holding the coats of those who stoned Stephen. Malcolm X spent the first chapters of his public life teaching a theology of racial separation that he himself would later describe as a form of intellectual imprisonment. These are not footnotes that history politely overlooks. They are central chapters. Because the weapon does not make you invincible, it makes you effective when it is wielded with humility and aimed at truth. The moment the weapon is turned towards self-justification, toward the defense of your own position rather than the pursuit of what is real, it becomes dangerous in the wrong direction. Humility is not the opposite of intelligence, it is its necessary companion. The truly intelligent mind knows how much it does not know, it holds its conclusions firmly enough to act on them, and loosely enough to revise them when better evidence arrives. It is capable of the two hardest intellectual acts available to a human being: saying I was wrong, and saying I do not know. These are not weaknesses. In a world that rewards false confidence and punishes honest uncertainty, the willingness to say I do not know is itself an act of courage. And it is the act that keeps the weapon sharp rather than letting it rust in the comfort of certainty. There is a person reading this or hearing this who has spent years waiting for permission, waiting for someone to look at them and say, yes, you are allowed to take up space. Yes, your observations are valid. Yes, your questions deserve answers. Yes, your vision is real and worth pursuing. You have been waiting for an external authority to grant you the internal confidence that you have actually possessed all along. And I want to tell you with all the directness I can muster that the permission will not come the way you have been waiting for it. It never does. The chosen ones throughout history did not wait for the systems that oppressed them to recognize their worth. Douglas did not wait for his enslavers to acknowledge his right to read. Malala did not wait for the Taliban to grant women permission to learn. Nelson Mandela did not wait for the apartheid government to declare that his leadership was legitimate. They acted from an internal authority that was not derived from external approval, and the external world, slowly and often violently and always eventually, had to reckon with them. Your intelligence gives you access to that internal authority, not because it makes you infallible, but because it gives you the capacity to reason your way to your own convictions rather than merely inheriting someone else's. When you know why you believe what you believe, when you have examined it, tested it, lived inside it, and found that it holds under pressure, that belief becomes something that cannot be argued away or ridiculed into silence. It becomes yours in the deepest sense, and what is truly yours cannot be taken. So let me close with this. You were not put here to blend in. You were not given this mind with its particular hungers and its specific quality of attention and its refusal to be satisfied with surfaces, so that you could use it to be comfortable. Comfort is not the calling. The calling is something older and stranger and more demanding than comfort. And if you are honest, you know it. You have always known it. In the moments when you went quiet and the world kept moving and you felt the gap between where you were and where you were supposed to be, you knew it. In the moments when an idea arrived in your mind so complete and so clear that you thought surely this was given, not generated, surely this came from somewhere beyond you, you knew it. You are not ordinary, not because you are better than anyone else, but because no one who has ever lived or will ever live has your exact combination of wound and gift, of experience and imagination, of the specific darkness you have passed through and the specific light you carry out of it. That combination is not accidental, it is an assignment, and the intelligence you carry, the one the world has sometimes rewarded and sometimes punished, and always underestimated, is the weapon you were given to fulfill it. Pick it up, sharpen it with honesty, aim it with love, wield it with the full, irreversible conviction that you were not put here to be quiet. You were put here to be useful, and the world, which is in desperate and urgent need of people who think clearly and act with purpose and refuse to pretend that everything is fine when everything is not, is waiting for you to decide that you are finally done putting down what you were born to raise. You are the chosen one, and your intelligence is the proof.